Sorry, y'all, I forgot to turn it on. What we were talking about is there's two things I'm looking for people to get out of the lecture. One is this idea of imagined communities, also sometimes in a related literature referred to as imagined ethnicity. And the other is what is going on with nationalism, particularly in Europe and the United States. This is an older theory. It's been around since the 1980s. It's very popular. It gets used a lot. It's started by Benedict Anderson. And this is something that's really just happened in the last 10 years, 15 years. And is pretty relevant to what's going on in the world today. So I also just basically had said that this was one of our more readable articles, so I was going to have people tell me about it. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Let's start with the theoretical stuff, and then we'll move into the specific context that it's being applied to. So, what did you guys glean about Benedict Anderson's theory? This is actually one of the better summaries of Benedict Anderson I think I've ever seen. It follows the book almost perfectly. What's Benedict Anderson's idea? What's important to understand about nations?
He kind of talked a little, I don't know if this is like his whole, his like general idea, but he did emphasize a lot on language, kind of in the beginning of it.
Yeah, so something interesting is happening with language. We'll definitely have to tease that out, particularly the shift from this sort of Latin community to national communities. So we'll have to tease that out for sure. Even before that, why is he using the word imagined, right? So do we normally think of nationality as something that's imagined?
Well, it's kind of interesting because he said we feel like a connection between people in our community or people in our race, but a lot of those people we're never gonna meet, we're never gonna see. So is there really a community? Why do we even feel a connection?
Yeah. So that's probably, can you have community with people you don't know? Yeah, that is Anderson's starting point. Why can you have a community with people? Because think about what makes something a community? How do we use that word? What is a community? We throw the word around in an everyday sense. He's not using it in any technical sense. So in an everyday sense, what do we mean when we talk about community?
Just like a group of people that are together, or a group that does things together.
Yeah, a group of people that, go ahead.
Well, just like she said, people that have a relationship with one another and know each other and do similar things and activities.
What pops into your, did you have something to share?
Maybe geographically located pretty close to each other as well, I would think. It would be hard to, you don't really classify people as a community when they're not the same place you are. So.
If you could think of an archetype of what a community might be, what would be an example? What image does the word pop into your head?
Like a neighborhood?
Yeah, like a neighborhood or a town, right? Anybody here grow up in kind of a small town? I grew up in a town that didn't have a stoplight. It was small enough, right? A third of the town was related to me. You had to be really careful when you dated. In that circumstance, right? The idea is you're connected to those people. You know them, you know who they are, you know what they think, you know how they feel, you know all their weird habits and idiosyncrasies, right? And that's kind of what makes you a community, is you're in it together, right? So we talk about nations this way. But his point is that really true? Can you categorize a nation as being the same sort of phenomenon as, like in this case, a small town or a neighborhood? No, right? Because why? Because people don't know each other. We don't actually know what Americans think and feel. Like, this is why we do surveys on attitudes, right? Like, nobody knows. Why is that? Because so when you think about like your idea of your nation, where does that actually come from? When you're thinking about a national identity, who are you actually thinking about?
Other people who are closest to you and what they think of it.
Yeah, you're thinking about the people in your immediate vicinity, right? That's how you understand it, right? You understand it through the people that you're actually connected to. So it's an imagined ethnicity, or imagined community, because we actually like think of it as something that we're interconnected with, something that we know intimately, but it's something that we actually know very little about. So that's kind of Benedict Anderson's starting point. Okay, let's get into, relatedly, a little bit different is the Gellner's idea of imagined ethnicity. So what does it mean to, getting back to the definition, right? Because we're not actually talking about race this week, right? This week we're talking about ethnicity. We're actually going to talk about ethnicity a couple of times instead of race, right? And we could argue that in some ways, like, nationality is the most pervading form of ethnicity in our lives, other than race. So talking about imagined ethnicity, thinking back to our first week, what's our definition of ethnicity? What is it? What is an ethnicity? Class is race and ethnicity, so we should all be able to define it by the end of the class, hopefully.
It's more culture instead of like physical characters of someone.
Yeah, it's a shared culture, right? Essentially, when people have an ethnicity, they're a group of people with a shared culture. Group of people with a shared culture. So what does that look like? What does having a shared culture mean? What do you share?
You hold some of the same values as well.
You say often have the same values about things. Yeah, you feel the same way about what people should do, how they should do it. What else is similar?
Like the same like traditions and like maybe religion.
Yeah, same traditions, usually the same religion, right? Or at least a lot of people will have these shared things. What else? What else falls under culture?
Would language fall into culture?
You probably speak the same language if you're a part of the same ethnicity. What else? There's a lot of really mundane things. Same food, same clothes. You know, if you're talking more anthropologically, often the same work. You know? So like, you're united by these like sort of like pretty significant similarities in ethnicity, right? So could we think of reasons why nationality would be referred to as an imagined ethnicity often? And this is very related to the idea of imagined community.
Because we don't all share those things?
Yeah, because by and large, people within a nation state, right, don't actually share those things, right? There's in fact huge currents of other ways of doing things, other ways of feeling about things, other habits, other traditions, sometimes other language, right? Are there Americans born who don't speak English? People who are full citizens of the United States? Yeah, there are. There's even like languages that exist in the Southwest that don't exist anywhere else. Is there like, have you ever heard of Spanglish? This is quite literally a phenomenon that you get people who no longer speak English or Spanish. They speak this sort of variant mixed language in between the two. If they go to Mexico, no one can understand them. Here, no one can understand them. In their own communities, people can. Right? That's like, can you, like, in some ways, would we classify that as an American language usually? No, yet it's from here, right? It's homegrown, right? So if you think about, like, the idea of the imagined ethnicity is that there's an idea of what people in the United States should be like that doesn't actually correspond to who is here. Okay, so why are these interrelated? Another way to put it is, who do we assume is the ethnicity of our imagined ethnicity? What ethnicity do we assume is American usually?
Usually whatever we are.
Yeah. Unless you're a minority who is particularly aware of the fact that they're not like, their culture is not the dominant culture in the United States, you're just assuming that it's your own. Right? In a mundane sort of way, there's differences like, so I'm trying to remember where some people are from. Anybody want to share? Anybody from someplace not near here?
Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay, so you're from South Carolina. Is people in Kansas really very similar to the people in Charleston, Atchison, Kansas?
No, they're like kind of different, but yeah, I don't know. It's kind of weird because, like on campus, I feel like we're all kind of like, we're from a lot of different places, so
Yeah.
it's very different and, yeah.
Anyone else want to share? Yeah.
I'm from Seattle, Washington, and it's very, very different from Kansas. Just geographically, but also just the people are very different. It's a very liberal area. It's like not a big deal to walk across rainbow sidewalks and like crosswalks, but like here that's not really the norm.
Did you want to share as well?
So I'm from Magnolia, Texas, so this is different but in the opposite way. So I'm close enough so that way, it's more of a 50-50 split between, the whites and the Spanish community. So, here it's primarily whites, so it's different in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, so in some ways, like, yeah, you have quite a bit of diversity in your community, yeah. And it's, so like, and I think about, like, I'm from Michigan, which makes me, like, in some ways, probably more similar to Canadians than I actually am to people here, or would be to somebody in Texas, right? Like, so, like, really culture exists in these sort of flows. Often flows, and yours speaks to this as well, flows that don't represent national boundaries. So like culture doesn't respect where we draw our lines in the sand often, right? So, but like, nonetheless, like there isn't really a unified culture to America. There's just a feeling that there is one, right? So like and why is that? Well, how do we get that feeling? Well, the same way we get this imagined community, right? It's because we know what we know immediately. We know the people that we're connected to, and then we just assume, right, that everybody else is the same, right? But it's not really true. Okay, so I want to preface too, Benedict Anderson is not necessarily harsh to these fake communities, if you will, these imagined communities. Because there's something positive and there's something negative about them. And so you really have to suss out like what is the dangers of an imagined community and an imagined ethnicity versus what are the benefits of it. So, okay, so getting to the history, we should back up and do the history. Have people always existed, and we came across this a little bit on our rant, have people always existed in nations? No, right? have people always identified with the state that they live in? No, no, as a general rule, like you think about when we were talking, where we started with McNeil, right, and the idea of polyethnicity, right, you have, McNeil. You have, like, very much so, very diverse states where people generally don't identify with the state as anything but rich people you pay tribute to. Right? Like, so, like, the nation, like, is something that has to some degree, a very recent history. Like, if we're talking about world historical, right? 1600 doesn't seem like recent, but it is. So how does Benedict Anderson talk about this shift? This is where we get into some of the language stuff. How does he talk about this shift into having nations? What forms of community, some of which are also imagined, right, did people have before? Can we catch this in the article?
Kind of talked a little bit, he talked a lot about when they wanted to like translate the Bible from Latin, and he talked about how Latin was kind of, seemed like above other languages like in that area, I guess, at the time. And then, yeah, like administrative languages, I guess.
Yeah, so he talks about Latin, refers to it as an administrative language. And he refers to quite often in this section, right, the Latin community. Right? Which is what kind of community? What unites it? Why did people learn Latin in the Middle Ages?
Is it to read the Bible?
It's a religious community. Okay, so what's the significance? Because like Benedict Anderson is just interested in Latin as like a social scientist, right? So like, what's the significance of Latin here, culturally, to the time before states? Which we could ask, like, who speaks Latin? Does anybody know who speaks Latin back when it was still spoken?
Clergy and those who like attended religious services, or at least some that were like educated in that language, I guess.
So clergy, most people who attended services didn't know what was going on per se. They didn't necessarily speak Latin. So you had clergy. Who else? It's another really important population that does a lot of talking in Latin before modernity.
Yeah, like the Roman population who spoke it. So like when they were conquering the world, like that sounded like it spread worldwide.
Yeah, so you have even before that, you have the Romans using Latin. Latin's their language, right? That's where it comes from. But I'm thinking specifically a little later, right? So by the time you get to where you have different clergy, basically the church body speaks Latin. But who else speaks Latin? Does anybody know? Another population. The rulers speak Latin. Like, not as their primary language, right? What their primary languages are whatever language they come from, right? Whatever region they're from originally. But they all know how to speak Latin. It's the only language they all know how to speak, right? So, like, you know, you have to talk to a politician. Like, well, today, if you think about, like, if you were to travel abroad, what language do most people know how to speak? Probably the majority of people in the world know how to speak. English, right? So like, that's sort of like the closest we get to a universal language, right? And it's pretty easy for English speakers to travel because of that. But at this time, essentially what you get is you get Latin being used much in the same way, in a place that's much more linguistically diverse, right? So what happens to, and so that's tied to what? It's tied specifically to people's identity within a specific community, in this case, a religious community. People generally referred to Europe as Christendom, right? This idea of this sort of community of shared people with the exact same religion, with much, by and large, on some level, the same culture, right? But it's united across this sort of religious frame, right? And that's what unites a good chunk of Europe. So there's this, and modernity dies away. Can anybody think of reasons why this would die away as something? Like you no longer go and politicians, the EU doesn't get together and speak Latin with each other, right? Like, that's not how it works. What language do people write in the Middle Ages? Do people know this? Or more aptly, which ones don't they write in? Take a history class, right? What are all the titles in? If you get back before modernity in Europe. They're all written in Latin, right? What languages don't people write in? The ones they speak in, yeah. So by and large, like there isn't often an accompanying written language to most of the languages being spoken, right? So people just wrote in Latin for the most part. So you're thinking about like, we have this one form of community, right? Which is equally, according to Benedict, equally sort of a imagined community, right? There's actually probably very little uniting, particularly like royalty across different parts of Europe, other than the fact that they can talk to each other. And even you think about religiously, there's a lot of diversity within the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages that people rarely talk about, right? So like even that doesn't create a uniform body in terms of ethnicity, maybe in terms of belief, right? Dogma, but not in terms of ethnicity, right? They have different cultures surrounding them, but they imagine themselves as a unified culture, right? So this shifts into what we have now. So you have, and this is parallels of some of the history we talked about before, right? Where at one time you had these sort of like large empires that sort of expanded and collapsed, right? And then in the Middle Ages you have feudalism, decentralized power, lots of people, right? Have small amounts of power, nobody really has very much. This then, but what overarches that medieval system, that sort of chaos of decentralized power, is the religion. And then what happens in let's say the late 1400s to the 1500s religiously in Europe?
The Protestant Reformation.
The Protestant Reformation, right? So after the Protestant Reformation, do people have this imagined shared community of Christendom anymore? No, right? The Protestant Reformation sort of shatters this community. Or at least, it's not like going back to like it's an imagined community, but the thought of it gets destroyed, right? And there's nothing really to replace it initially, right? And so this is the environment in which the idea of nationality grows up in. So here we have the fall of Christendom and the rise of nationality. And this is where we get into the idea of, it talks a lot about the printing press, right? You mentioned this earlier when you were speaking. What happens, what's something that happens when they first get the printing press?
So they, like print, I guess the Bible was like massively printed, but not in, or is it printed in Latin right at the beginning or after, and they translated to German or something like that?
Yeah, so not very long after the printing press happens, right, which is all around us, right, so technically the printing press predates the Protestant Reformation by a little bit, right, but almost immediately after this is invented as a medium, and what's the significance of the printing press? Just to make sure we all know this. You guys know this, right? What's the difference between between the printing press and what came before it in terms of producing books.
And it made like text more easily accessible, more people could have books.
Yeah, and why could more people have books? Because it's
Easy to print.
cheap to make, yeah. You know, some guy doesn't take 8 months to write the book by hand, right? Like, instead it gets produced very quickly. Movable typeface means that you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time, et cetera, et cetera. Anyways, so books are being produced in mass, yeah, initially just in Latin, but then once the Protestant Reformation happens, it almost immediately switches over to being colloquial languages. So spoken languages now have, now are being written for the first time in a lot of ways, right? Or at least written in mass production kind of way. And so here you get basically like the creation of more, like rather than Europe sort of having this overarching sort of community that they imagine, each individual country starts to develop their own individual communities, right? Make sense? And this itself is often very forceful, right? And I think I maybe mentioned this before. Does anybody know, like, before this, there wasn't such a thing as the languages we think of now, right? So there wasn't such a thing as French or German. These didn't exist. They're a product of the creation of the printing press and the creation of a national government. Initially, like, you know, in countries like France, they speak, I think France had something like 82 different languages being spoken into it. It's spoken in it in the Middle Ages, right? So very different dialects, you know, that eventually get literally turned into something illegal, that you're no longer allowed to speak in it. So like that's it. So the national culture is something that's always been sort of accompanied by these forms of force, right? That in essence like police that unity. Does that make sense? So here we see kind of and so if we're to take this sort of story, right, of the creation of the idea of a national community, what's a positive of having national community? Or having a national imagined ethnicity? What sort of some of the positives of these things? What might be?
Usually, the people of that area are a lot more united with each other. It's hopefully a lot more peaceful, I guess.
Yeah, so to some degree things are more united and ergo in some ways more peaceful. What else? What else might be positives? Well, let's think about a negative. Like, let's imagine that here in Kansas, rather than there being like primarily one language being spoken, that you all came from your outside areas to speak, right? If instead you came from, like, you spoke Texan and I spoke, like, I don't know, Michigander, right? And then, like, we showed up here and there's 27 different languages spoken in the state of Kansas. What may be a downside to that?
Since it's a place of learning, you have to have some type of unifying language to get the message across.
Yeah, well, and even like, let's say it wasn't a place of learning. Let's say you just came here to work at MGP. What might be the downside of that?
Don't understand when to work or anything like that.
Yeah, it would be very difficult to communicate, right, across different groups, right? So like, the advantage of the idea of an imagined community is that it creates a certain amount of unity, and that unity creates a little bit of fluidity, right? Even if it has to be enforced, like it creates a certain amount of fluidity. And that affects things like, you know, if you think about like, we have sort of like one stable government, right, between us. That probably wouldn't be the case if we were so decentralized, right? National unity creates one solid government, it creates set boundaries. Things get more peaceful in a lot of ways under nation states, right? I've never experienced a war in the United States. None of you guys have either. This probably wouldn't be true if we were living in decentralized power, right? So like there's strong advantages to nation states. commerce is more easy, right? So these imagined communities, even though they're not real, they have real consequences, some of which are positive. What might be a downside to having a national community? The idea of an imagined national community, or an imagined ethnicity. What might be some negatives?
If everybody has like a common language and a common kind of way of thinking and everything, it probably makes differences a lot more apparent.
It makes differences a lot more apparent. What else? There's some negatives. Let's say you are one of the people who represent difference, something that isn't included in our national unity. How do you experience this?
If you don't belong.
You don't belong. What else?
People might be like less open-minded about like your, cause like you would probably like think a little bit differently and like do things differently, so they'd be like less open to that.
Yeah. Or we could probably state that even a little stronger. Rather than less open, what is it often? Nations are often hostile to difference. Right? And so this is the downside to this, is that this creates a system where it's hostile, openly hostile to difference. In the religious imagined community, there's some hostility to difference, almost in an abstract sense, right? Like, you may be hostile in some senses to people who live thousands of miles away that you're not even really sure if they exist or not. But in an immediate sense, are you probably going to be pretty tolerant to people's differences? If you're living in such a diverse place, and there's no idea that it shouldn't exist. Yeah. You're going to be pretty comfortable interacting with people who speak a different language, who wear different clothing, who are different, right? You might have hostilities with one of them, or two of them, but as a general rule, like, you're not going to be hostile to all of your neighbors, right? You're going to instead, because you're under one government in a lot of ways often, right? You're going to be kind of working together. But there's no idea that you should have a shared language or a shared culture or a shared ethnicity. That doesn't go along with it, right? So like nationalism, or the idea of a nation, right, also constructs these sort of boundaries where we're often hostile to difference, right? So one way in which we're hostile to difference is we're often hostile to people who don't come from here, even people who get here by legal means, right? And we're often hostile to some subset of the population, right? And this is often, you could think about things like, in our own context, right? And I could do this with any nation. This isn't necessarily me harassing the United States, right? Can you think of things that are un-American? What might be something that we would colloquially describe as something un-American? I'm not saying you have to agree that it's un-American. I'm just saying you have to say it. Yeah.
Could it be like terrorism, I guess, against?
Yeah. I think it kind of falls out of it. Like, if you start blowing stuff up in the country, like, that's, you know. I think reacting to that might not be reacting to difference, it might be reacting to something else.
Not speaking English, like as a first language, or just using.
Yeah. So lots of people speak a lot of different languages. If you look at government forms, right, bam, like, often they have like, 10, 15 different languages. All those languages are commonly spoken in the United States, right? By people who have every legal right to be here, by people sometimes who are natural born citizens, just as much citizens as you are. but we think of it as un-American. It's un-American not to speak English, right? Does anybody, so, you always hear people complain, this is just sort of like a weird aside. Has anybody ever spent any time in a place where you didn't speak the language? It's kind of funny because like, if you've never done that, you kind of feel like when people are speaking in another language around you that they're talking about you. But then when you actually are the person who does that, you realize that like you just do it because it's more comfortable. Did you guys have a...
Oh,
No, just share aloud, yeah.
Two of my suite mates they just like speak Spanish all the time. Because we have a really cultured suite and we didn't even plan it like that. So there's like someone who's Mongolian, there's 2 Mexicans, I'm Indian, someone's Irish. Like it's like a big mix of like everything. Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, it is fun. So, other things people can think of that we might describe as un-American. I mean, there's a lot, right? Let's just suss them out. Might be asking you to say something uncomfortable. It's okay.
Talking food, you say like food? Because we call it like Mexican food, Chinese food, you know.
There we get kind of an interesting, so like, I think food becomes a great example of imagined ethnicity, because the Chinese food we eat in America, where does it come from? It's American food. Like, you don't get that food in China. If you go to China, like, they don't eat that food there, right? Italian food, like, doesn't taste like food from Italy. It tastes like something you would make in America that you call Italian. Mexican food is actually Tex-Mex. We just don't call it that, right? Like, it's all kind of like, you know, all the things that we associate with other countries aren't, right? They're transculturations. Have you ever heard that term before? Transculturations is when you mix different cultures, right? So like, what we often identify as being from someplace else is actually a transculturation, you know? Transculturation, I always think, I had a friend, Ming Fang, when I was an undergrad, who was from China, and he would cook like Chinese dishes, but he'd use bologna in them because it was cheaper, right? So like, it was like, that's a transculturation. Well, and I transculturated with him because like I got to learn like different spices he uses and sauces, and then I go to the Chinese market in KC like once every 6 months and stock up, and you know, it's not Chinese food. Like I'm not that good. Like I don't know how to cook anything that would actually be eaten by somebody in China, but I can throw the spices in something and like boil the crap out of it. It still tastes good. It's not the right texture at all. Anyways, right? But this kind of idea is transculturations are those. But it kind of also shows like we imagine that those things have to be something else. They're not American, right? But in reality, they actually are. And so yeah, that's a good example. What other things could we think of as un-American? There's all kinds of stuff we define as un-American. Yeah.
People say lots of different religions are un-American.
Yeah. So we often have hostility towards certain religions, right, as being un-American. Belonging to them makes you suspect. You're not a part of the national unity, right? What else? And I mean, this even like, so like thinking about like, you know, if you were in the early 20th century, being Catholic would be un-American, right? Because often Catholics were viewed as kind of belonging to a religion that they weren't supposed to. That's why we often refer to the, like, a lot of people will caustically refer to the, like, what we'd say the hegemon, the dominant group in America, as WASPs, young white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? The reason why the P's on there is because at one time, like, Catholics were viewed very much so as kind of an un-American population. When JFK became president, right, there was a big stir about whether he would be more in line with the Pope than the United States, right? So like here you get an example of it. Not so much true anymore, right? Like national lines shifted, and I think Catholics are more seen as American than they used to be, right? But at one time that would have been placed you as suspect, right? What else? Which actually has a history of immigration too, right? Because like being Catholic was associated with being an immigrant, whether it was an Irish immigrant or somebody from Mexico or whatever, right? Like generally speaking, like that was seen as like you having come from someplace else, at least your family at one point. We can think about politics, right? Like something like people will describe this was you think about like in the 30s, right? The Un-American Affairs, right? Was like this thing where they went out and found people with certain politics, right? The people with those politics, people who are communists or socialists or whatever, right? They're from America for the most part. It wasn't some sort of like foreign invasion, right? But their politics got seen as something outside of, right? All these things get sort of like, and that's actually like, so the difficulty is like with imagined communities is often this construction of a we self becomes, and that's the term that gets sometimes used, the we self is the like what we identify as belonging to us or not belonging to us, right? It's largely false. It's a false divide, right? There's all kinds of things that are actually very American that we just don't think of that way, right? And there's power behind it. There's a power to defining something as not belonging, right? So that's the dark side, if you will. So the positive side is you have community, you have the ability to interact more easily, you have the ability to organize more easily, right? All these sort of things that come with the nation. But on the dark side of it, it has this sort of like filtering process that people often themselves get caught up in, right? So you can think about things like most major atrocities that we have had in recent years could be interpreted as an extension of the idea of the nation, right? So like whether we're talking about something like the Holocaust, right? Whether we're talking about something like the internment of the Japanese in the United States, right? All these things are caught up in this idea of what belongs and what doesn't, right? Okay. Any other thoughts or questions about the theoretical framework of imagined communities? One last note, for Benedict Anderson, most communities are imagined. Just like the Latin community was imagined for him, just like national communities are imagined. Generally speaking, you don't know all the people in your community. And even like a town the size of, if I talk about the Atchison community, I actually have in mind the like 30 people I know in Atchison, right? And I extrapolate from there, right? So for him but not all imagined communities work the exact same. Something specific to a national community. Okay, so does anybody know what's happening in recent history in terms of immigration and far-right politics? This is an interesting development politically, one that's worth talking about. And it's been happening in the United States, and it's been happening in Europe. Is anybody familiar with what's been happening with immigration? Let's just start with in Europe. Nobody's aware of this? So, starting in, this crisis has been going on for a while. Starting in probably 2012, somewhere between like 2012 and 2014, there started to be a mass migration of people from the Middle East. This is often referred to as the Syrian refugee crisis. Are you guys aware of this? Just as like an aside, when I studied in Germany, when I took language classes, almost everybody in my classes were Syrian. Because there were so many people coming from Syria that didn't speak German that like I was just placed in the same classes as them, which was actually, and I actually lived in a Syrian neighborhood when I was there. So it's funny because I went to Germany assuming, and I didn't know any Germans other than my one teacher, but I knew a ton of Syrians and I lived with somebody who was Cuban. Anyways, this is sort of an aside, right? But you have this sort of like large influx of immigrants into most countries in Europe, right? People are kind of aware that that happened. I see some nods. Okay, does anybody know what happened to politics as a result of this? What did people get afraid of? What do people usually get afraid of around immigration? Yeah.
Well, don't they think, at least with like the Syrian crisis, they thought like more terrorists, because like terrorism was really like in the Middle East, so they thought that activity was going to translate over if they were immigrating into their own country.
So there was some fear of terrorism, that's true. That's not what I was trying to lean towards, but that was something that occurred as well. What else were people afraid of?
With an influx of workers, you would fear of losing your job.
Yeah, so job loss, that usually gets tied in with immigration. People are afraid of that. What else? Is there something to draw more?
Maybe they'd be like afraid that these people are like gonna change their cultures or whatever or something.
Yeah, and so that's one of the big things, is that people are afraid that it's gonna change the national culture, right? That their individual European countries are no longer gonna look like what they used to look like, you know, that everything will change, right? Do we hear that sometimes in the United States? Is a fear. So, anybody familiar with what's happening with immigration in the United States right now? I see some nods. Somebody want to jump in? What's happening in terms of immigration in the United States? Do people just not want to say, or do people not know? Trying to figure out. Give me something, guys. So in the United States, there's recently been increasing fear of immigration, right? Ironically, in a time when immigration is actually quite down. But nonetheless, right, there's been this sort of fear of immigration. And do we hear the same sort of language? That people are going to come in and change the national culture of America? Yeah. Right? And so, so in both Europe and the United States, there's been this sudden influx. To be frank, like when I was your guys' age, nobody cared about this. Nobody talked about this. This wasn't a fear that people had. Ironically, in the United States, in a time where there was a lot more immigration, because our economy was a lot stronger when I was young than it is now. So there was more people trying to move in to make money, right? Even illegally, especially if we're talking about illegal immigration. Does anybody know who's primarily trying to immigrate in the United States right now? That's creating a big fuss? Where are they from? They're from Guatemala. So there's a whole flux of people who are coming who are in refugee status, right? So that was the thing that elicited the sudden fear of immigration in the United States. Okay, so getting back to Europe, what happened in Europe is we had this sudden rise of far-right authoritarian parties. Right? So far-right authoritarian parties had a tendency to be somewhat anti-democratic, right? And to be really, mostly gear their policies towards the extradition of immigrants, right? As a sort of mobilizing factor. So this is looking specifically at one example of this, which happened in Austria, right? So Austria is currently under a far-right regime. There's almost a far-right regime almost took France. There's a rising far-right regime in Germany, but it's unconstitutional to have a far-right party because of what happened in World War II. So like, there's different tensions there. So they're like arresting people for it and stuff like that. You had far-right seized power under the Golden Dawn in Greece. The far-right seized power in think where else. So then, just as like a summary sort of way, a good chunk of Europe went to sort of nationalist authoritarian parties, right? So we're currently existing. England is another example of one that went into a far-right nationalist party. That's why we see people pulling out of the EU. You guys are familiar with the Brexit thing, right? This is all tied up with the immigration crisis. That's what initially triggered it. So like the idea is that England wanted to shut down its borders so that it wouldn't have to take any immigrants, and that's why they pulled out of the EU. So that's all tied up in that, right? So like what's going on in Europe in particular is we currently see a movement away from having Western democracies and towards authoritarianism in response to immigration, which is also definitely a threat in the United States. There's been a rise of something called the alt-right. Have you guys ever heard that term yet? The alt-right is just what we call the far right in the United States. So like the far right in Europe, the alt-right generally have been leading with policies about immigration or asking for policies about immigration. It's a little bit different because do we have a far-right party in the United States? Does anybody know the difference between the United States and a lot of other people's party systems? The difference between what happens if you're a parliamentary system versus a presidential system?
I just think of like Germany, because doesn't Germany have like a ton of political parties?
Yeah, most European countries have a ton of political parties. In fact, they all have to form coalitions with each other to get anything to happen, right? So like, how many parties do we have in the United States? Like really, like we have all the little parties that never win, but like how many parties do we actually have in the United States? 2, we have 2 parties, that's it, right? A dual party system. So like it's a little bit different, and the far right hasn't been able to have exactly the same effect that they had in some European nations because of that, but they're nonetheless sort of shaping politics in the United States kind of in a proxy sort of way. So they're moving the Republican Party further towards the far right. So that's what's currently happening in the U.S. politics, right? Once again, this is usually accompanied by more authoritarian, usually in general, populist governments are, you know what populism is? Know this? Populist governments is basically when, rather than sort of like within the normal structure, you have mass movements altering politics, right? So populist governments are when all of a sudden you have a large portion of the population that sort of like seizes a political party or something like that, right? Populist governments have a tendency to move things towards, right, authoritarianism. And we do see that in the United States. There's a danger of it here. There's a danger of it elsewhere in the world. And this is, and once again, like tying these two together, as our author does, what's the connection here? There's one thing we didn't quite talk about when we talked about imagined communities, which is which has to do with the emotional quality of community. Right? How do you, we can think about this on a smaller scale and then move up. How do you feel about your communities? Communities you belong to. Your hometown. How do people feel about places like that often?
I feel an attachment to them.
Yeah, you feel an attachment and connection. So part of Benedict Anderson's point, so we talked about sort of the practical end of unity, but the other end is that it actually creates these emotions, right, that hold the community together, right? So even though the community is imagined, we have the feeling that we get from people we're actually connected to, right? Which is great in terms of getting along, going back to that, right? So like, you know, that's why we have, you know, in anthropology they often call them rites of intensification. We have all these sort of like traditions and rituals as Americans that we all kind of follow in often, right? So like 4th of July, fireworks, you know, singing the national anthem before, right? And what these things do is they elicit a certain feeling of unity and commonality, right? So we are capable of, in some ways, transmuting the emotions we feel about people we actually know to people we've never met. Which feeling positive emotions for people you've never met is pretty good, right? Like, that's a good outcome, right? That's something that Benedict Anderson is, but just like with the practical end, there's a dark side to that emotional appeal, right? And that dark side can often be seen in the ways in which people can be mobilized to often do very harsh things to people. Not to put too fine a point on it, we basically have concentration camps on our borders right now, right? Where people are dying at fairly high rates, even higher rates than they were a year ago, a lot of which are children, right? And we don't really do much about this, right? What is this about, right? This is about the mobilization of people through the idea of national unity, right? Because they're a population that is un-American, seen as not belonging here, there's a feeling that we can do whatever we want to them. They're outside of this extended feeling that we grant to other people, right? Getting back to, like, this is very different than in a religious community how this would work, right? To some degree, like, religion, Christianity stuff has a certain, like, a certain universalism to it, right? We're supposed to be respecting everybody's humanity. Nation-state ideology has no idea that other people are human in some ways. It's not a part of that system. Their humanity is not equal to yours, right? So we can mobilize people to do all kinds of things, right? And so, like, something like what's happening there, right, is a direct response to the creation of national unity through imagined community, right? It's the dark side. Make sense? And that's why, and so, like, you hear the term nationalism sometimes, right? Nationalism, like, is essentially that the politicization, right, of national unity. And so, so often that accompanies these sort of, like, flows towards the far right and, the violence that ensues from that. Make sense? Okay. Any questions or thoughts or feelings people want to share? Once again, this is my summarization of the art. I feel like I'm just going to, like, say this as a, like, blanket statement every time. You do not have to agree with things that are said in the class, right? As a general rule, literature on race and ethnicity is going to take a certain stance about defending minorities and people from other countries, right? All the entire literature that we're going to read, like, there is very little legitimate literature in race and ethnicity that does not do that. So, like, it's going to be a constant theme. If you have other opinions, you can feel like you can share those, right? So I'm not pushing an agenda per se. I'm just trying to reflect what the literature does. Make sense? Okay. Questions or thoughts? Did I just depress people? Is that all that's happening? Like, somebody told me in my intro class yesterday, they were like, that's the most depressing lecture we've had all year. It's like, thank you. It was about rising eviction rates in the United States, right? Like, sociology is kind of like used to be this SNL skit, Debbie Downer, right? And she'd show up and she'd, say something really depressing while people were having fun. I feel like that's, like, the natural state of a sociologist. Like, people are just going about their day enjoying it, and then you're just like, oh, there's this really depressing thing happening over here where you're not looking. You should think about that. It's generally how the profession works. So. Okay, any questions on anything related to the class? Cool. We'll pick back up, I think, talking about columns on Tuesday. And I'm hoping to roll straight into the article for next week as well. So I'm going to probably spend a lot of time talking about the first chapter that you read for this week, the one on basically kind of like the Black women's consciousness. And I'm probably going to spend a little less time on the sexuality thing, partially because, like I've been saying for weeks, we're going to have something on sexuality coming up later. We're going to have a week on
take home you would do again?
I'd have to look at the syllabus.
It's next Friday.
Next Friday.
Is it
Thank you.
before like Friday, like by Friday?
No, it's a Friday at 11:59, so it's basically just due at the end of the week.
Oh,
If you
okay.
just think of it that way. You can turn it in anytime you want to. Like, you don't have to wait to turn it in. It's been open since the beginning of the semester. Like, that's just when I'm like, and I do it on Friday, and I'm gonna be real honest with you guys. I don't ever grade them until the next week. So like, to be honest, like if you turn it in on Saturday or Sunday, I don't notice the difference. I assign it on Friday as the due date because like, I figure that saves people the weekend. But I also know that like less is going on right now on the weekend, so if you guys just want to like kick that a little further down the road 2 days, you can. So, but if you want a weekend, turn it in on Friday. Thank you guys.